Well, there's a new method being used to try to learn more about what's happening inside the borders of Syria. A group of reporters with publications including the New York Times has taken to using the online pin board Pinterest to try to post pictures and analysis of weapons in rebel possession. They're hoping to learn more about exactly where these weapons are coming from. Take a look at what they've found. Now, in some cases, they're finding weapons in the possession of these anti-government fighters in Syria that are marked with the impression made in Iraq. There are many other types and origins for these weapons. And it's interesting that Pinterest has now become a place for people to pool information. To talk more about this, I am joined by freelance journalist Emmanuel Stokes. Emmanuel, quite a bit of confusion here about what's actually happening in Syria, of course, but let's talk about this pooling of information when it comes to where these weapons are coming from. Why is this an important project?
It's important because fundamentally, if you find out where the weapons are coming from, you begin to learn about what sort of sides are, what sides are involved in the conflict and who's funding who, or arming who, rather. I found the thing, the main thing that we have to say, though, is we don't know for certain. I mean, okay, we've got some photographs from Mr. Chivers, which say stuff like made in Iraq. Now, that doesn't surprise me too much, but making the connection between that and, say, al-Maliki, who's sympathetic with the Shias, and saying that he's involved in the conflict, we can't be totally certain about it. But
yeah, I think let me just stop you there. I mean,
caveat.
A lot of people, might know that the leadership government in Iraq is supportive of Bashar al-Assad's regime. Coming up with conspiracy theories that they're, simultaneously, arming the rebels is certainly, would be misleading. But some of these weapons are actually quite old, and most people don't believe that weapons are being manufactured in Iraq now. A lot of them were from the time when Saddam Hussein was in power. So, kind of taking a look at that, talk about what we can draw from, historical context and the fact that some of these weapons are quite old.
Yeah, no, it seems that basically the new government has taken hold of the storage of weapons that Saddam had, and maybe sending that, to increase its regional influence, particularly in Syria, because the main issue here, and what the whole thing about weapons flows froze up for me, is the fact that this is fast becoming a proxy war, or even a sectarian war to some degree. Not entirely, and I think it would be to oversimplify things to sort of simply call it that, but I believe that's sort of happening. And we can see that, it's quite clear that, just from reports, for example, in the New York Times in June, the US are vetting weapons that are coming in from Turkey, and it's clearly a sign that they know that arms are, that are coming from foreign powers, in particular Saudi Arabia. That's another thing. We saw weapons that were made, that said, boxes of weapons that said, made in Saudi Arabia on the Pinterest sort of site there. So, but it's been known for a long time that these local powers are getting involved in either side of the battle, and it's becoming increasingly a fight between the Sunni dictatorships in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to some degree, not totally, and also the other side, which is supported by Russia and China and so on.
Well, I think that's a really good point. We're seeing these pins of these weapons and what they say on them and what they look like. But one of the things that's not being pinned, at least to my knowledge, is about the rebels themselves, who they are, and if they are indeed unified about more than just ending Assad's regime. Talk about this, Emmanuel. What do we know about these rebels?
Well, what do we know about these rebels? Again, you see, we can't be totally certain, but on Al Jazeera, which is, it to me has appeared to be fairly pro the FSA to some degree. Again, I don't want to make massive generalizing statements, but, they are Qatari owned, so anyway. They interviewed, I think, one of the leaders of the FSA, and he said, yeah, we admit that we're infiltrated by jihadis. The jihadis are coming, according to all reports, from all over the Muslim world, but we don't know exactly who they are. We know that they've got some links to people, like they're listening to Adnan al-Aror, who's a famous, some would say, Salafist sheikh. He's a Syrian expat who lives in Saudi Arabia, and he's made various blood-curdling statements about killing Alawites who do not side with the FSA. Yeah, I mean, the FSA, I mean, if you go back to the very beginnings of the Arab Spring, which is, of course, almost totally out of the picture now, but the uprisings that were in Syria, you had Mikhail Kilo and Riyad Dra, who were some of the intellectual leaders of the uprisings, and they didn't want an armed conflict against a monstrous tyrant who naturally had his forte would be, savage brutality, and having a greater amount of, weapons and military might. And what's really happened is the values of the Arab Spring have seeped out as this has, increasingly become an armed fight. But I mean, there's a lot of hypocrisy going around. I mean, at the same time, Moscow, I mean, Putin's a pretty bad human rights abuser. And we've seen that recently with a lot of things, including, with pussy rights. So, you can't take a moralistic stance from either side. I think you have to be quite objective about what's going on here. And it just seems like it's a dirty war being fought with hard power, i.e. military hard power, for political gain. And what really needs to happen is some kind of compromise.
I think it's important too, Emmanuel, to just talk about connecting the dots here. I mean, one of the main reasons that we know so little about what's going on in Syria is because we see when journalists do try to report from there, they're kidnapped. It's just very, very hard to get in, is the bottom line. So I guess, I mean, is this, as a freelance journalist yourself, I mean, do you think this is a new age of journalism? It seems like in this case, in the same way that Pinterest allows, people to function as a village, putting together the best recipes for lasagna, these people are pooling their information about these weapons. What do you think is going to be the end result here?
Well, I mean, the trouble is the internet is abused. I mean, you've got YouTube videos that you can't confirm of people being, tortured, being executed by the FSA in the streets. Now, they seem pretty convincing, but we just don't know. We don't know who they've come from. We don't know their provenance. However, yes, Pinterest, loads of other sites can be used. But, the internet is also a battleground for propaganda and has been since its early days. Just as the media to some degree, have been since the media's been in existence. What's particularly interesting, though, is citizen journalism, and this is something I respect very deeply, and this is what I like about being a freelancer, is I can sort of say what I want, and try and get at the truth. I mean, of course, you can do that if you're a staff reporter, but you do always have to bear certain things in mind. Citizen journalists are, they don't have an agenda. They just want to tell the truth from their own, perspective, and I think to faithfully represent their own experiences. So that's a very interesting development in war. And I mean, given that, we've seen, like in Iraq, you had an awful lot of embedded journalists who, towed the line of the whatever nation, the government of whatever nation they're reporting for.
Well, they saw what they were shown. They didn't see, those who wanted the protection of the troops. They saw where they were taken, and that's the story that they have. Let me just ask you one more question. Because you are in New Zealand, we're obviously based in Washington, D.C. Last week here, we had the vice presidential candidates debate. I just want to play really quick what Vice President Joe Biden said regarding Syria.
We are in the process now and have been for months in making sure that help, humanitarian aid, as well as other aid and training is getting to those forces that we believe, the Turks believe, the Jordanians believe, the Saudis believe are the free forces inside of Syria. That is underway.
So upon seeing this, the question a whole lot of people asked is, what is the other aid the vice president was referring to? I guess I'm just curious, too, what the reaction to this was internationally, Emmanuel.
Well, I mean, essentially what we've got at the moment, I mean, if you read the, Chivers was the New York Times journalist, or he wrote an article in the New York Times that went along with his Pinterest piece. He was talking about how a lot of people inside Syria were saying, well, the West is not really doing a lot. It seems to me that the West, and so, international reaction was probably, talking about, oh, we hate this deadlock and so on and so on. And I think most people feel that way. The question that hangs over a lot of people's minds is, how do we solve it? And how do we solve it without it turning into a massive mess? In terms of what he's referring to, Biden, about other support, well, I mean, we know some aspects of what the US is doing. I mean, they definitely know about the flows that are going in. They said that they provided non-lethal support, but it's pretty clear they're probably monitoring it with satellites, even drones. And so they're providing diplomatic support and intelligence support, I think, to the rebels. Beyond that, it's hard to speculate, and I think I've speculated too much already about aspects of what's going on. So
it is just an interesting, I mean, just such an interesting story. At least we thought that the whole Pinterest aspect, the idea of various journalists, freelancers like yourself, pooling information just to try to better connect dots about a story that, frankly, we just don't know much about. And we appreciate having you on the show, especially from New Zealand, freelance journalist Emmanuel Stokes. Thanks so much.
Thank you.